Well, after taking a short break to discuss my research, the things that I've been working on, studying, and really finding interesting, and hopefully those conversations were helpful to you as well, I am back discussing this book and why. Where is this coming from? I don't know if you guys can hear that. I don't know. That's weird. Okay. I don't know where that was coming from. If you guys could just hear that in the audio. Whenever I go live, and now there it is again. Whenever I go live, it just starts randomly playing my show back to me, and I don't know where. Where is this on YouTube? I don't know where that was coming from. If you guys could just hear that in the audio. Whenever I go live, and now there it is again. Whenever I go live, oh, this is gonna really bother me because it's just. I'm sorry. I don't know where. Where is this on YouTube? I just hear myself in my audio 5 seconds repeated. Oh man, guys, this is really annoying. What is going on? Is it coming from my desktop? Or is it coming from my laptop? There, mute that. Let's see if that works. Okay. I don't know why that wasn't muted to begin with. Let's just try that and see if it works. Okay, so I am finally back. I am back to the conversation, going through this series, discussing this book. Oh my goodness, it's taken me forever. There it is, showing up in the middle, covering my face so you can see for those of you watching on Instagram. There it is. Why There Is No God. Simple responses to 20 common arguments for the existence of God. And since it's been a little bit of time since I've walked through this series, this is part 8. There have been 7 different parts before where we've covered things like science explaining the complexity of the universe, therefore God must exist, or God's existence is proven by scripture, or unexplained events are miraculous, therefore there must be a God, or morality stems from God, and without God you can't be good, or belief in God would not be so widespread if it wasn't true, or God answers prayer, therefore he must be true, or I feel a personal relationship with God, therefore he must exist. And those are the previous 7 chapters that I've covered in this series. You can find them on podcast, Instagram, or YouTube. Chapter 8 then is specifically going to dive deeper into this thing called Pascal's wager. And really this is a cost-benefit analysis of whether it's safer, or claiming that it is safer to believe in God and be wrong than it is to not believe in God and go to hell. And so we're going to look at Pascal's wager, what that is, and how to respond, and what Armin Navabi, an atheist who wrote this book, part of the Atheist Republic, what he thinks about this argument, ultimately why he thinks it fails and does not prove or show the existence of God. So that's going to be today. As always, join the conversation. Thanks, Phantom X. Yeah, well, I couldn't find a tab with any of my videos open, and so that's why I was so confused, is there were no tabs anywhere unless there's some hidden tab somewhere. I couldn't find. So anyways, that is going to be the topic. As always, I want to encourage you. You can post your objections, your comments, your questions in the live chat, whether on Instagram or YouTube. You can also on YouTube use that link that I posted there, and I'll share it over to the Instagram as well. Use that link I posted, and you can call into the show. And so you can use audio, call into the show, and we can discuss and talk through whatever question or objection or argument that you want to talk about. And so that's kind of fun. So to jump in, my name is Ryan Pauly. This is Think Well, where I try to train you to think well about the Christian faith and against the culture, and about the culture so that you can engage the culture well. So you really have a deeper understanding and knowledge of these different ideas so you can engage well. And that's why I started this series. Back in the beginning of the year in January, I reached out to followers, listeners of the show, and said, what do you want more content on? And the winning vote was more apologetics content. So then I was on some, Facebook groups for some atheists, had posted this book and said, man, this book is great. It offers simple responses to 20 major arguments for God. And I thought, hey, maybe that's a good book to start with. And so I'll walk through this book one chapter at a time with the ultimate goal of this is that, look, if these are arguments that Christians are using, the question is, should we be using these arguments? And then Christians, if you're going to use these arguments, you should be aware of what atheists think in response and how they're going to respond, so you can kind of be better prepared to know what objections are going to come to respond to those objections. As well as atheists, I think some of the things I've read in this book so far are really good and others are not so good, and you're going to see a little bit of that in today's show as well. So hopefully, if an atheist is watching this, you can realize how maybe Christians are using these arguments right or wrong, or even how atheists sometimes misunderstand the arguments that Christians are trying to use, and often leads us to talking past each other. So my hope for this series is trying to bring some clarity on this as best as I possibly can. And maybe I'm getting some stuff wrong, and that's why I want to offer you the chance to push back and ask your questions or call in. But hopefully bringing some clarity that will lead to better, more productive conversations between Christians and atheists when you're trying to talk about whether God exists or not. And so that's what I've hopefully been trying to do with each of these chapters, and that's what we're going to try to do today as we discuss this chapter 8 in the book on Pascal's wager. So with that, let's jump in. Again, I have some comments. We'll see how long it takes me to get through it. I always think it's going to be shorter and it ends up being longer. But again, as I'm doing that, think of questions, comments, objections, post them or call into the show. And I'd love to chat with you more on what you're thinking about, what you're curious about. So Chapter 8, Atheist Armin Navabi from Atheist Republic titles this chapter, "It's Safer to Believe in God Than Be Wrong and Go to Hell." And so really in this chapter, he's addressing this idea. So Blaise Pascal was a mid-1600s mathematician and philosopher who introduced this argument that now is called Pascal's wager. And it's, as Armin says here, his argument discussed the issue of religious belief from a mathematical standpoint, determining the cost of the belief of Christianity is lower than the cost of believing in atheism. And Pascal, or at least Armin, breaks down Pascal's wager like this. Number one, if you believe in God, and he does exist, then you will be rewarded with eternity in heaven. Number two, if you believe in God and he does not exist, nothing will happen to you. 3, if you reject belief in God and he does exist, you will be doomed to an eternity in hell. 4, if you don't believe in God and he doesn't exist, nothing will happen to you. Right? So this idea of if you believe and are right, you get rewarded. If you believe and are wrong, no big deal. Same thing's going to happen. You just die and you stay dead. But if you don't believe and you're wrong, man, there's eternal consequences. And if you don't believe and you're right, there is no God, then again, nothing happens. And so really it's that believing and not believing really does factor. Therefore, cost-benefit analysis, maybe you should consider believing, is kind of the way in which this is presented. Now, before I get to some of his objections, let me just say this. I did a show about 5 years ago, and it's not on YouTube because I wasn't doing YouTube 5 years ago, but it's on podcast. You can find it on my website, and I can link to it in the description of YouTube, or send me a message on Instagram and I'll shoot it over to you, where I discuss and kind of walk through a little bit of what Pascal was getting at here. And I think from what I've seen in interactions that I've had online with individuals, Pascal's wager is often misunderstood. It is often applied in ways that Pascal never intended. And I just want to be clear from the beginning. Look, Pascal's wager was never meant to be a substitute for evidence. So it's never use this instead of discussing evidence, never. And it was never meant to be a rational proof. In fact, Phantom X, I think I just saw you post it here. Pascal's wager doesn't even try to argue for the existence of God. It is an argument for why you should be a Christian, or whether there is a God or not. And I would say, yeah, I think you're on the right track. But I would even take a step back a little bit different than how it was framed there. It was never meant to be a rational proof of God. It was never meant to be a substitute for evidence. Blaise Pascal was a mathematician and philosopher who came up with this idea, but he also presented evidences. He gave evidences from the resurrection. He gave evidences from fulfilled prophecy. Pascal used evidence to try to show the legitimacy of belief in Christianity. And so it was never meant to be a substitute. What Pascal is doing here, and trying to give you a little bit of background and framework before we look at Armin's objections, is because he is one that developed probability theory. And so he's trying to use kind of that probability calculus to try to get you to consider the cost-benefit analysis of believing. Now, Pascal is growing up in a time where a lot of people are religious in the 1600s, like Catholic and Protestant. There's a lot of religious things going on, as well as kind of naturalists are sprouting up. And so really his argument, Pascal's wager, was aimed at those who suspended judgment on the ultimate issues. Ultimately, this is something to get those who are apathetic to think about it, right? So again, it's not a proof. It's not instead of evidence, but it's to say, look, you're sitting there and going, nah, I just don't really care. And it's trying to say, like, well, this is something that you should care about, Right? Was it C.S. Lewis or someone that said, like, I think it's C.S. Lewis said, if Christianity is true, it's of eternal significance. And if it's not true, it's of no significance. The only thing it can't be is moderately significant. Right? And it's like, look, if this is just some other thing that just is out there and it's false, then who cares? It means nothing because something else is true and this is now meaningless. But if Christianity is true, what you believe has eternal consequences. It's internally significant. The only thing Christianity can't be is moderately significant. It's the same sort of thing here. It's trying to say, look, you're apathetic. You can just go, I just don't really care. I don't think this is worth thinking about. And it's a powerful tool. This is where I think the power of Pascal's wager comes in. It's a powerful tool to say, hold on a second, just stop. Realize what you're saying here is like, if true, and if you believe, there is this reward. If you don't, there's eternal separation. Like this is something that matters. Right? It's like maybe death is the end. Maybe immortality is the end. Right? It's either or. Either the end of our lives is death and that's where we die. And okay, then that's one option. Or there is a life after this life. And you should probably stop and think about it, because if there's another life, that matters. That's huge. If it's only death, okay, well then we all wind up at the same place no matter what we believe. So, okay, whatever, do your own thing and do what you want to do. But if there is a life after this, and if our final destination is dependent upon choices and beliefs that we have in this life, then isn't that something worth thinking about? See, this is what Pascal, I think, intended with this wager, is not to be a proof of God, but instead to get people who just kind of suspended belief in God that went, well, I just don't really care to think about it, not worth my time, to go, stop for a second and just think about why this is worth time. It's kind of like, again, it's not meant to be a clincher. It's not meant to be standalone. Just looking at some of my notes. It's kind of like doing a cost benefit analysis when you are trying to get someone to think about their future, right? Where it's like, you got a high school student or something. It's like, I just don't really care what I'm gonna do one day. Like, I just want to have fun now. It's like, well, hold on a second. If that's the attitude you have, then you're not going to be prepared for this future. And then that could really come back to bite you years down the road. Like we need to think about this, right? If you're going to buy the home, think of the benefits of buying the home. Think about the negatives of buying the home, like kind of do an evaluation to see is this a good decision or not? It doesn't mean that it's true or false, but it's, again, to try to get you to understand the importance of it. And so that's what I think Pascal is coming from. I think the misunderstanding is often that it's used as some sort of proof. More so, I think it's meant to try to get people to think more critically about Christianity. Similar to the question I often ask that I learned from Frank Turek, where it's like, if I could prove to you that Christianity was true, would you become a Christian? Right? What you're trying to do there that's not an argument for Christianity. It's just saying, like, look, if I could give you all the evidence and prove it to you, would you then say, okay, I will believe? Or is there something else that is driving the choices that we're making, the beliefs that we have, where there's maybe some sort of cultural or volitional thing that is affecting us more, where it's like, well, even if you could believe, or even if you could prove that God exists, I still wouldn't believe. So that's ultimately, I think, what we got going on here. So with that in mind, let's jump over to chapter 8, look at some sections and comments that Armin Navabi has on this argument, and then we'll kind of respond, and I'll get to questions. So again, got questions, comments, thoughts, post them there, or use that link and call into the show live. So Armin starts by this. He goes, based on these suppositions that I listed there at the beginning, those 4 points, Pascal reasons that it's always safer to live as though God is real, because if there is a God and you believe in him, the benefits are infinite. If you believe in God and turn out to be wrong, you will have lost nothing. If you don't believe in God and you turn out to be wrong, the consequences are dire. And he says, look, Pascal was admittedly a brilliant mathematician. His contribution to mathematics are valuable. As a theological argument, however, Pascal's wager breaks down for several important reasons. So here's where he thinks this wager breaks down. Number one, first, he says, quote, it's important to realize that the wager does nothing to prove the nature of God. True, right? That is not where his argument breaks down. If your argument was never meant to prove the existence of God, then you can't say the argument breaks down, because it doesn't prove the existence of God. It was not meant to prove the existence of God. He says, look, it's not an argument for the existence at all. Actually, it's an argument against atheism based on the relative opportunity versus a cost of belief. And so again, I think that's why it's important to kind of have this background to say, look, it's not meant to prove God, and therefore it's not an argument doesn't break down at not being able to prove God when it was never meant to do that in the beginning. The second way he thinks this breaks down before he kind of goes into some other problems with the argument. And so I said, okay, Christians, let me just say this, Christians, this is not meant to prove God. So don't use Pascal's wager to try to prove God. Again, you should be using, and the power of Pascal's wager is to get people to get off the bench. It's to try to break down their apathy. It's trying to break down those who say, well, I just don't really care to think about this, and go, look, this is something that you should care to think about. Now, if you then start to get them to thinking and they start caring to think, then you jump in with some evidence and arguments and scripture and the different ways based on kind of where they're coming from, the questions that they have. And so Christians, if you're using this as an argument for God, stop. Atheists, this is not meant to be an argument for God, therefore it does not break down if this argument doesn't prove the existence of God. Let me jump here really quickly to the comment section because Phantom X, you're responding to something I just said. So to Frank Turk's question, which I mentioned, if Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? You say, if you could prove God exists, I'm not sure if I would be a Christian. However, I would no longer be an atheist. I would be a theist at least. And I think, hey, appreciate the honesty. And that's where, again, that sort of response is helpful. Now, for everyone else who's kind of listening, I think that sort of response is helpful because then I would be curious, Phantom X, what would it look like to prove God? How could God be proven? And then also I would just be curious if we could have a conversation, maybe privately if you want a message, of if I could prove that God exists. You said you're not sure if you would be a Christian. So what would be your hesitations about Christianity? Because again, for sure, if I could prove the existence of God, that doesn't mean the Christian God. There could be some other God of Islam or whatever. But I would be curious to kind of dig a little bit deeper and kind of just understand your story and what your thoughts are on why not Christianity, if I could show that there is a God who exists and created. So yeah, definitely a theist, maybe not a Christian theist, maybe not a Trinitarian monotheist, but you would at least move from atheism to theism. So appreciate that response. Armin's second response, or the second way in which he thinks that this argument breaks down, is that he says you have to recognize the limitations of Pascal's premise. As a Christian apologist, his argument works only for the Christian God. It ignores the possibility of any other deity and assumes the motives of God are consistent with the teachings of basic Christian theology. Viewed in the context of world religion, the wager falls apart completely. The wager is based on the mathematical analysis of 4 outcomes. However, if you throw in a multitude of world religions into the equation, the premises and mathematical analysis becomes much more complex and convoluted, making your chances of successful wager significantly slimmer. Again, I want to say you're right, but that's not what Pascal's wager was meant to communicate. Again, yes, it makes sense if he's talking from a Christian perspective. Pascal's culture was very much a religious culture and not necessarily this very religiously diverse culture that we live in today with a lot of different religions and a lot of different views. But again, the ultimate wager is trying to get you to think through at the point of your death, you either stay dead or you go somewhere else. Now that's true of all religious claims and all worldview claims. What happens at death, right? That's a big question of where do you think you go when you die? And there's either you go somewhere else or you don't go anywhere. You stay dead. Those are the only 2 options. Either you're going to get reincarnated and come back again as something else. You're going to go to some sort of heaven or hell. You're going to go to another planet. You're going to go somewhere else, or you're just going to stay in the grave and you're just done, right? Those are the options that we have. And so for the person who goes, I just don't really care. I'm just so focused on this life. This is all that matters. I'm just going to do my thing and see what happens. Pascal's wager is trying to get them to realize or think through, hey, no, stop for a second and consider this. Consider these points, consider that actually this question matters more than you think. And so I don't think in that sense, understanding this question within the context of world religions, that it falls apart completely. I don't think either of these points on which Armin points out of here's where the argument falls apart, it doesn't prove God, and input world religions and it dissolves. I don't think so. I think again, if you understand the intention of Pascal in hitting that apathetic person, I think it still fits and goes through. Cool, Phantom X. Yeah, I'm looking forward to I'll chat with you. And I'm if it's email, I'm really slow. DMs, I'm a little bit better. Okay, so the second then kind of section after Armin discusses kind of his introduction on what the argument is and why he thinks it falls apart, he looks at choosing the right God. Again, I think this is the last section of his chapter. So I'm getting close to being done. So we're going to end early. So if you have questions, comments, thoughts, put them in there. If you want to join the conversation, click on that link and join live. But he says, look, choosing the right God. Multiple religions exist throughout the world, and the message of most are at odds with each other. Now, I thought this sentence was really interesting, really fascinating, because it really does contradict this common view that we often hear of our culture of all religions are basically the same. And they all basically teach the same thing. And religious pluralism, they all lead to heaven. And Armin, who is a former Muslim, now atheist, is like, no, the message of most religions are at odds with each other. And he goes, look, the two largest religions, Christianity and Islam, it's clear that worshiping the right deity is the appropriate way worshiping the right deity in the appropriate way is crucial to finding salvation. To enter heaven as a Christian, you must be saved by believing in Jesus for your Savior. He quotes some Bible verses. According to some verses in the Quran, non-Muslims will all go to hell. All this means that belief in God alone is not sufficient to enter heaven. Instead, you have to believe in the right God, and you have to either trust in him or do certain things. And again, I think this is a wonderful point made by an atheist. Not all religions teach the same thing, and simply having a belief does not mean you go to heaven as a Christian. Right? We have to understand this idea of faith as something so much deeper than simply believing true facts. Faith is not merely propositional, believing something true. Because even the demons believe true things about God. The demon, Satan, believes that God exists. But again, he believes and shudders. As Christians, we are called to believe and to love. Right? There's a different response to our belief. So we have to recognize that simply believing doesn't get us into heaven. And it's not simply believing that there is some sort of God out there. We actually have to have correct views about God. So he goes on to say, it also means that if you happen to believe in the wrong God, you can still end up in hell, even if you follow the tenets of your chosen religion perfectly. Again, atheists making a great point. Each religion is exclusive and saying, here's how you get the best that our religion has to offer. Right? In Islam, a simplistic way of saying is look, that we are born Muslim, that we are in rebellion against Allah, and that submission to Allah and doing what he has commanded you to do is the way in which you are saved. In Christianity, it's that we are born in sin, that we are in rebellion as well, but we can't save ourselves. It's all about trusting in Jesus Christ as our salvation. It's Jesus who has the power to forgive and to save. Right? If you look at Mormonism, hey, there's a call. I'll get to you here in just a second. If we look at Mormonism, then there is this understanding of believing in Jesus provides all salvation, kind of this universal salvation where you go to some level of heaven, but in order to reach exaltation, eternal life with Heavenly Father, you have to go through these certain steps and you have to do certain ordinances. To whereas I go and talk to a lot of Mormons, and by the way, I'll be in Utah next week talking to members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They don't believe that I'm going to reach exaltation. I'm not going to get the best that their religion has to offer because I'm not believing the right things. So it's interesting that Armin even addresses this issue and says, look, these religions contradict each other and they each have their way of living and the thing that you have to do to get the best that that religion has to offer. And so it's not just believing in some sort of general idea, but really it's believing the right things based on what that religion teaches. And so there's an importance here of understanding these different religious views. And so what we have to recognize is there's truth here. And so it's more than just simply believing that there's some sort of God and, as Pascal wagered, just like, well, yeah, if you believe in the right thing and you go, it's like, yeah, but there is more, it's deeper. But this idea, this argument is an attempt to get people to stop and think rather than simply it's not a proof of God or proof of Christianity. So with that said, Phantom X, you called in. So I haven't done this for a really long time. I'm just going to do audio only, but I think if I add you as this guest, then your audio should come through. It says your guest is in the green room. Let's see. Because if I click here, let me try this really quick. Let me do this. Yeah, that's not what I want to do. Sorry. Oh no, that's your solo. Let me go back. Sorry guys, it's been a really long time since someone's called in and I've clicked on the right thing. So okay, that's what I want to do there. How do I pull you out of the green room? Oh, there we go. Remove from green room. That's a simple button, but it still says you're in the green room. Oh, I should have tested this. Let's see. I signed you as my guest and you are muted. Will unmute. What just happened? Oh my goodness. This is really frustrating. Okay. Go back to live mode. Maybe I have to be back in here. There we are.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Hi, how you doing?
Pretty good. I'm in a bad area, so I may lose connection.
Okay, no problem. Awesome. So, hey, first, let me just say thanks for being here a lot. You're here almost every single week, and so it's been fun to see you and kind of engage and see your thoughts and comments. And so I appreciate that. Thanks for coming again. And what's on your mind?
I just you said you wanted to have a conversation with me. I just wanted to clarify. I'm saying if you proved the Christian God to me, I still don't know that I would become a Christian. And it's not because I wouldn't believe he doesn't exist or anything like that. I would obviously, if you proved he existed to me, I would believe he exists. But then I'd have to deal with other issues that I have with the Christian God, assuming that God exists.
Right.
And so that means that I wouldn't necessarily become a Christian. It means I would no longer be an atheist.
Yeah. So what it sounds like you're saying is something I often hear a lot, maybe clarify and see if I'm right, is that I often talk about on this show too, that this idea of what we're kind of dealing with or what was happening in a lot of the conversations is it's no longer simply just giving apologetic arguments to show that God exists and then people accept him. But really there's a lot more deeper questions, questioning God's goodness, questioning God's character, where it's like, even if you could prove to me that this sort of creator God exists, I still don't think he's someone worth following, or I have issues with different passages of scripture to where I would still have an issue with Christianity in particular. Sure, there's this God, but I don't think he's worth following. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm saying.
Okay. Could I ask what would be some of those kind of problems that you have with the Christian view of God that would keep you hesitant to become a Christian, even if his existence could be proven?
So I'd say probably the biggest one, and I mean you said it in you're not an annihilationist, correct?
I am not. Right.
Okay. So God has decided to create these beings, and some of them he's decided he's going to send to torture for eternity. And in order to do that, because God created everything, he also created hell. He could have it just said, no, you're not, you just won't exist forever. You'll be annihilated. But instead he decided, no, I'm going to go ahead and send you to torture for eternity. That's a problem for me. Yeah. Like, that means that's not a good thing to do.
Okay. So I'm sure you've probably heard objections and responses kind of defending eternal conscious torment. So why, maybe if I start, why would you see that? And I guess it kind of makes sense, but I'm just kind of curious how you would explain it, or what you would say is to cause someone to not exist, or to completely to destroy someone and eliminate them, to annihilate them. Is that a better, more loving thing in your mind than punishment?
To be honest, so I grew up fundamentalist Christian. I was raised in a Baptist church uh, and when I don't know, I was younger than 8. I couldn't tell you but when I first heard about what heaven would be like, I'd be like, I thought to myself, I really don't want to do that. I don't want to exist forever. I'd rather just have it all end. But if I'm going to exist forever at that age, I was like, I'd rather live where I'm not being tortured forever. And so it was more of like the lesser of two evils was choosing heaven. But personally, I would think I would rather not exist than go to heaven
Okay.
forever. I'd
Yeah.
rather not exist forever.
Okay. Yeah. So I know. So let me just say this. I know a lot of Christians who are annihilationists, who do see it as being problematic that God, who loves us, would create us and then keep us alive for the purpose of punishment. And so I would maybe push back a little bit on the use of the word torture. I don't think the Bible is talking about this being torture. I think it uses the term torment. I think there's a difference there because with torture, we often see this picture of someone is torturing you, right? Torture is an external thing where, someone's pulling out fingernails or poking you in the eyeball or something like that forever. And I don't think God is sending you there and then he is like sitting there burning you with hot irons and doing torture that we often think of. I think that what happens there is a torment that comes from within being different. But that aside, there's a lot of Christians that I know and I'm close with that do hold to annihilationist view. They can't understand why God would create someone, cause their soul to be immortal, to live forever, for the sole purpose of punishing them in hell. And so they do hold to an annihilationist position. And so would that be something that if that is kind of, and I do think it is, if that is something that is within the possibility of being a Bible believing Christian and holding to this view, that I think it's a view that can be disagreed upon among Christians. I guess the question would be, is that where do you see that as an option of saying, okay, I could be a Christian, but just a Christian who's an annihilationist versus the mere fact that the Bible teaches or that Christians believe in eternal conscious torment, I would not even want to be a Christian. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, like, so if you convince me that the Christian God exists, and then you also convince me that the annihilationist version of Christianity was true, that would take away a lot of my problems with it. But, just because it's what I want or what some people believe, reality is what reality is, regardless of what anyone wants or what anyone believes. So,
for sure,
like, if God created hell, it doesn't matter whether some people think that the annihilationism is a thing. God created hell. And same thing if God exists, whether I believe it or not, God exists. Right. So you have to, and the way I was brought up, I think it'd be pretty hard for you to convince me that if God exists, hell does not.
Right. So it sounds like you're convinced there is no God, or at least some sense an atheist, right? And then, but at least on this point,
I'm more lack of belief, not convinced there is no God.
Okay.
I would say I am convinced the Christian God, as described to me growing up, does not exist.
Okay. So perfect. So at least the Christian God does not exist, but specifically on the view of hell, it sounds like what you're saying is that you are convinced that the biblical view is eternal conscious torment. And so that's what you think at least has been described to you, and that would be the biblical view. And so if someone could convince you that the Christian God does exist, they would also then have to persuade you on annihilationism is true, because you're convinced otherwise on that point on hell. Is that right? Am I understanding that rightly?
Yeah, I mean, I would say at this point, I would say if there's a God, that entails God created hell. I would have to look more into annihilationism because I didn't really know about that when I was a Christian, but
yeah,
that's my belief at this time.
Yeah. So can I ask you, and by the way, whenever you need to go, let me know. So I'm not just keeping you here, but if I can ask you, if the Christian God does exist, what what should he do for those who, in a Christian view, are in rebellion, who have sinned, who have done wrong, who have been given opportunities to be saved and forgiven and have rejected it and said, God, I don't want you. God, I want a life without you. If that, what I just painted is true of reality, then what should be done with that person? Is it then they should be annihilated, and the fact that God doesn't annihilate them, is that kind of the sticking point for you?
I'll be honest. If I were to say this would be the most perfect God, it's a God that has voluntary existence for eternity, and what that means is no matter whether you end up in heaven or hell, when you get tired of it, you can just choose to not exist, to stop existing.
Interesting.
And so yeah. You asked me what I think God should do. If God exists and is interested in us, that's what I would say God should do.
Yeah. I think that makes sense. I guess my question back would be, there's a lot of stuff that I think God should do. There's a lot of stuff I think as growing up, I thought my parents should do. It's kind of, I don't know, your family situation, right? But it's like, as when I was a kid, it was like, why didn't my parents do this? I think my parents should do this. I think my parents should do this. And even as I got married, before I had kids, I would look at other parents, as often happens. I was just having this conversation the other day. It's like, oh man, I think the parents should have done that. This is the way to discipline, or this is the way to do X, Y, and Z. And then you have your own kids and you go, oh, wow, I was clueless, right? I didn't understand because I'm just not in that situation. And so I think in that perspective, and I think, look, the God that I believe in is all knowing, and his knowledge is far and above mine. For me to say, look, I think this would be better, is in one sense, in my perspective, claiming that I somehow know better than the God who knows everything, or I think that there's a better option than the God who knows what's best. And I often give the example, like in Why God Allows Evil, of, when I give my 2-year-old vaccines and I'm sitting there holding him down while the nurse is shoving needles in his arm. And I'm sure in his little 2-year-old mind, he's going, I don't think Dad should do this. This should not be happening. If Dad really loved me, then he would stop this pain from happening. And my response is, I'm sorry, son, but you don't understand. One day you will. And so there's a reason that I'm allowing this pain or this thing to happen in my kid's life, where he's saying, if you really were a good dad, you should not allow this to happen. And so I think if the knowledge difference between me and my 2-year-old son, where I say, give it a few more years and you'll get it, and then he will grow up and maybe understand, what is that knowledge difference between us and God, where I say, look, God is an all-knowing being. There's things that don't make sense in my mind, but because I trust in him as being good, I go, look, maybe I think this is the way it should work, but God, I ultimately trust in you. So anyways, that's kind of like my thought process. And so the question is like, how, when we were saying like, this is how God should do it, it seems in my perspective to try to be making a claim, or at least as if we're coming from a perspective that really we don't truly understand. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. You asked me what I thought. Part of that is you asked me what I thought God should do. So, I have to answer that, and that's going to entail telling you something. But I also, really honestly, no matter our lack of knowledge, I just don't see how you could argue that what I described, voluntary, eternal life, could be any worse than involuntary eternal life, because I also always have the choice not to continue existing, Yeah. So that existence would be essentially the same as involuntary eternal existence. I just have the choice to at some point stop that.
Yeah.
And I can't imagine a way that someone smarter than me could say, well, no, that doesn't make sense. You should just be forced to do this.
Yeah. So what do you think about the fact that, like, I think, now I don't know exactly where you're coming from, but you've watched the show recently in past weeks. And I think for me, what I see a lot is this idea in our culture to truly be free, to be free of any sort of limitation or any sort of barrier upon our lives. And then that is kind of this ultimate good. Like, I should be free to choose whether I exist or not. And this should be ultimately my choice. The reality is that there's a lot of things built in and designed into reality that are outside of our control. And that we recognize that with things that are designed and things that are made, there's a question of what was it made for? How should I use this thing? Rather than I should have the free choice to use it however I want. Or at least we recognize, the analogy I use right with my phone is I have the free choice to use my phone however I want to use it, but I realize that there's a lot of ways in which I could use it that will destroy it. And that's the reason, because the phone is not designed and created to be used in that way. And so we as humans have the free choice. We can, commit suicide, or we can not. We can choose to love. We can choose to hate. There's a lot of free choices that we have, but we recognize from a Christian view, because we are designed and we're created just like the phone is designed and created, there's things that will benefit and there are things that will hurt. There will things that will lead to flourishing, and there are choices that will lead to destruction. And so we are not this completely autonomous individual, I think, that we often want to be, but instead as a created being, whether that's through the process of evolution, just the product of this result, or whether we are created by the hand of God. The issue is that there are features built into us that limit our capacities to where we do not have the sort of blanket freedom that we often think that we have, or that we think would be good because of how we either evolved or how we were created. And so I think that if that's how we are, and that's what we recognize to be true of reality, we may want true freedom, but we recognize that's just, sometimes it's not the way it works. And I think so like, well, hey, wouldn't it be better if we could just float off the earth? And it's like, well, yeah, maybe that would be fun and we wouldn't need airplanes, but that's just not the world we live in. We're made in a world with gravity. And so sorry, that's not a choice. And so I guess I don't know how I'm framing this into a question or a thought back, but I think it's, in my mind, when I hear that, I go, how do we rephrase it rather than what could in another possible world seem, in my understanding, to be better? The question I come back to is, in the world in which we live in, what is true about reality, and how do I live it according to that? And so if we are then created and designed by God, and God created our souls to be eternal, not something that we are the ultimate decider of life and death, but God is the one who gives and takes away life, not myself, then I now have to change, or at least the options I have change based on the circumstances that I've been built into or designed into. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, but then you just get back to the problem, that the problems I have with the Christian God is, I mean, that is the problem, is, he created our souls to be eternal, and they created some of them knowing that they would be sent to hell. And I just don't, so I mean, what you're saying is we have to live with this world, and I'm saying, yeah, and I have a problem with that world. I don't know that I could follow that God and worship it.
Yeah. So do you think, I don't know what you said, you grew up fundamentalist. I don't know kind of what your leaning is as far as your view of Christianity being Calvinist or things like that. But do you think God is causing those people to go to hell against their will, or just that he knows they are going to go based on their own free choice?
So when I was brought up with free will, Calvinism was not, we weren't Calvinists. As I've worked through, hey, what does this mean and all that, I've come to the conclusion that that no matter what, God could not have given us free will. And I can take you through that if you want.
Sure.
Okay, so if God could have created any reality, and knew what reality he was creating, so he created a reality where I choose vanilla ice cream or I choose chocolate ice cream, and he chose to create the reality where I chose chocolate ice cream. I never really could have chosen the vanilla ice cream. God already created the reality where I was going to choose chocolate ice cream. And so the only choice that was ever made in that paradigm is which reality God was going to create.
Okay. So, but if God knows, so what I've often said on the show, and you probably heard me say this, is that knowledge does not stand in a causal relationship with the physical world. Would you agree with that? That knowing what will
Um,
happen does not cause that thing to happen.
yes, I would agree with that,
Okay. So if God
but that's not what I
knows,
said.
well, so coming back then, if God knows, if I create this world, Phantom X will choose this freely, and he knows what you will choose, that is different than God causing you to choose it. So if God knows what you will freely choose, given the creation of this world, and then God creates that world, it doesn't then remove that you are then freely choosing it.
Um, you know, no, because then that you're now taking it not from just knowledge to an action. God created a world,
Right,
and
but
that is an action. And by creating that world versus any other world, God chose which world would unfold.
for sure, he did choose what world would unfold, but that word freely choose in the logical argument doesn't just disappear in the conclusion. So if you say God
Well,
knows how
so I
you
mean,
will freely choose, then God creates, now he knows that you will freely choose or that you do freely choose. Freely choose doesn't just disappear if he knows how your free choice will play out given different options.
so so I would say if you're talking about, especially if you're talking about libertarian free will, that what you just described is incoherent. It can't. It is impossible for libertarian free will to exist in what you just described.
How so?
I mean, because I could say, uh, libertarian free will is the idea that I could have done something different.
Right.
But if God created the reality where I do this, I could not have done something different. Now I could have had a compatibilist type of free will, but that's not libertarian free will, which is kind of what um, Christianity, the idea of, at least my idea of Christianity hinges on, is libertarian free will, and I just don't
Right.
see how that could exist in if God could have created any reality, chose to create this reality. I don't see how libertarian free will can exist.
Right.
Because here's the
So
question: can I surprise God? Can I do something God didn't expect?
no.
Then I can't. Then I can't choose anything. I can only choose whatever God knows I'm going to choose.
Exactly. But that's why I started with the first question of, does the fact that God knows what you will choose cause you to choose it? And you agreed that knowledge does not stand in a causal relationship with the physical world. So God
Right.
knowing what will happen, so it does not in any way mean that you could not have chosen otherwise. He just knew what you would have chosen. So God says, look, I'm going to create you, and you're going to have the option. If I create this world, you're going to have the option at this point in your life between chocolate and vanilla. And I know that you will choose vanilla. He then creates that world, and you still have the option to choose chocolate or vanilla. And he knows that you will choose vanilla. Now, if you would have chosen, because you could choose chocolate, you could have done otherwise, and you could have chosen chocolate, he just would have known that you would have chosen chocolate. And that's why I think it's important to point out that knowledge does not stand in a causal relationship with the physical world, is that God knowing what you will do and your inability to surprise God in no way is causing you to do it or removing your ability to do otherwise. Because if you would have done otherwise, he just would have known that. You still had that ability.
All
He's
right.
just not going to be surprised because he knows the future.
All right. So now we're getting into another thing. So back to the knowledge. Is knowledge causal? It is not causal. But what we didn't ask, and I would have answered this way if you'd asked me at the beginning of the question: can perfect knowledge of the future is perfect knowledge of the future compatible with libertarian free will? And I would say absolutely not, because I cannot do otherwise. So God's knowledge of the future removes libertarian free will.
So that's where I
Uh,
don't see that conclusion, because I think you could have done otherwise, but God would have known that. So his knowing what you will choose, I don't see how that removes your ability to do otherwise, because again, he is not controlling you. He's not eliminating that option. He just knows which option you would choose given your free will choice.
um, So liberty, because I could not have done otherwise. I don't see how I could have. Just because I had the choice of chocolate and vanilla, and I had no one forcing me to choose chocolate over vanilla, does not mean I could have chosen vanilla.
Why not?
Because it's deterministic.
Well, that's what I disagree with that conclusion. But yeah,
if perfect knowledge of the future is possible, then reality is deterministic.
So that's where I'm not following that conclusion, because again, deterministic would mean causal, right? If it's determining that you do this, then it's causing, right? Causal. If it's determined. So how then?
Yeah. So I mean, like, let's say I don't think when you get down to the quantum level we are in a deterministic universe, but let's say we are, because at the macro level we do seem to be in a deterministic universe. But if someone were able to, figure out all the workings of the deterministic universe and figure out what's going to happen in 10 minutes, they would know what's going to happen in 10 minutes. That doesn't mean they would cause it, but they would still be what's happening because it's deterministic. It's working on mechanics and not anything else. So knowledge, a deterministic universe does not create a causal relationship. It just removes libertarian free will.
Yeah, so that's where I guess you're not seeing my conclusion on why I think free will can still be possible. I'm not seeing your conclusion. I mean, I've heard it many times that the claim that this sort of knowledge of the future has this determining factor that removes some sort of libertarian free will. I guess the point I'm trying to push back on is I just, that sort of conclusion, I don't see how that follows logically from that sort of argumentation, if that makes sense. Because again, if it's not deterministic in a causal sense, but more so this is what will happen, the question is, why will that happen? Because you're freely choosing it. And God knows that if you would have chosen otherwise, because you still have that option, then he would have known that you would have picked the other door. It's kind of like someone, saying, I heard the analogy once of walking down like a hallway of a bunch of doors, and it says, pick any door that you want. And you walk down this hallway and you choose door 75, and you open up door 75, and there's a note from God. It says, I knew you would pick this door. And the question is, well, could you have picked door 76? Well, yeah, you could have. But if you would have picked that one, then note would have been in that room saying, I knew you were going to pick this one. And so God is not causing you in that causal deterministic sense. He's not forcing you to pick door 75, but he has a knowledge of the future of what you will choose. You still have the ability to choose otherwise, but if you would have chosen otherwise, then he would have known that, and the note would have been in a different room. And so him knowing which one you will freely choose does not take away your free choice when you're going to make the choice of which door to open. He just knows which one you would have opened. But again, he's not causing it. And so the determining factor is not a causal determination. Therefore, you still have the ability to choose otherwise. That's the way that I process through this. And at least that's why I don't think that perfect knowledge of the future removes our free will choice and our ability to do otherwise. So I don't even know if that makes sense, or you go, yeah, I get that, but I just still disagree. What do you think?
Like I said, I just don't see how perfect knowledge of the future is compatible with libertarian free will. Now, there's other versions of free will that it's still compatible with, but libertarian free will, I can't see how that could be. If you are, because libertarian free will is saying that it isn't determined. But if it is determined, it's not libertarian free will. It's something else. It's a different kind of free will.
So do you think that what I'm explaining, does it not make sense, or do you think it logically breaks down somewhere?
I think what you're explaining is not libertarian free will. So it's more of a compatibilist type of free will.
So then how would you determine, or how would you explain libertarian free will?
Libertarian free will is the real ability to do otherwise. Compatibilist free will, are you familiar with that?
Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, to me, that what you're describing sounds more like compatibilist. At least my understanding of compatibilism.
Okay, so what I'm saying is I do, maybe I'm not explaining it well, but I do very strongly believe that we do have the ability to do otherwise. And so I do consider myself having libertarian free will, because I do think that I could have done otherwise. I could have picked a different door. I could have picked chocolate over vanilla. I could have gone to one school over another school, because I don't think that God's knowledge of what I will freely choose removes that free choice or the ability to do otherwise. One example that has been shared on my show before, from a colleague of mine, Tim Stratton, he uses the example of an infallible weather barometer. Have you ever heard this one before?
Doesn't sound like anything I've heard.
Okay, I think William Lane Craig uses it too, but he says, imagine this fictional device that we'll refer to as an infallible weather barometer, one that is never wrong. Suppose that we could type in the date and coordinates into this infallible weather barometer of any place and any time into the future, and it will always yield a perfect weather forecast. Next, suppose we ask the infallible weather barometer what the weather is going to be like in Spain 10 years from now, and it predicts and tells you that in 10 years from today, it will rain in Spain. Now imagine a decade passes, and lo and behold, there's rain in Spain. He says the pertinent question is raised just because the infallible weather barometer knew that it was going to rain in Spain with perfect certainty. Did the infallible weather barometer cause it to rain in Spain? And the answer would be, of course not. And so that's kind of what I'm addressing here, is this idea of knowledge doesn't stand in this causal relationship. And so just because God knows what will happen doesn't necessarily mean that God caused it or forced it to happen. And so if God is not causing you to make your choice, and God is not forcing you to make your choice, then you do have a free choice that's not caused or forced, in which you could have chosen otherwise. If I can't legitimately choose otherwise, and I have to choose that option, then it is either being caused or forced. But if it is not caused, so it's not causal, because knowledge doesn't stand in a causal relationship with the physical world, and God is not forcing me to do it, then I do have a real sense in which I could have done otherwise. So what do you think? Yeah, go for it.
So I think you're missing an option there.
Okay.
So back to that barometer. No, the barometer did not cause it, but the weather could not have been anything but rainy.
So again, so that's where that analogy is applying it to a different area, in the sense of whether it doesn't have a consciousness to make choices like humans do. It's just simply saying, does the barometer cause it, or is the barometer just have knowledge, but not a causal relationship? That's all that analogy is trying to show.
Right, but I'm just, and I agree that I agree with you 100% that knowledge is not causal in nature. Not someone having knowledge, but doesn't force them to do it. But them having that knowledge, not even if they have that knowledge, if that knowledge is even possible, then libertarian free will just can't exist. It's not compatible with a reality where perfect knowledge of the future is possible. Okay.
So I apologize. It's 3:00 and my son is going to go down for a nap soon. His bedroom is right there and I keep him awake if I keep talking. Let me just ask you one more quick question. We can pick this conversation up next time if you want to call back. I guess my curiosity then would be this. If it's not causally determined and it is not forced, then why wouldn't someone have the ability to choose otherwise?
If we live in a deterministic reality, it's determined. They physically could not choose something other than what's determined.
Right, but if God's knowledge is not causally determining, in what sense then is it determined?
Well, I mean, I'm talking about it in a reality, regardless of whether anybody knows it or not. If the universe is determined, you could not choose otherwise physically. Like, it's just impossible. You couldn't do that. Even though you feel like you could have chosen, you really could not have.
Right. So then that's a forced sense. You couldn't have done otherwise.
Yeah, you're forced by something. You're forced by the nature of reality to do whatever your choices are. Okay. And you don't feel like you're forced to choose, but you are forced to choose. Now, someone having knowledge of that future is not causal. The way it's causal is because God, the Christian God, chose which reality to create. And that's where the force comes in, is by which reality God chose to create, not by the knowledge in itself.
Okay. Perfect. Well, hey, I'm going to have to run on that point. I'm going to make some closing thoughts, but Phantom X, thank you for calling in, for sharing. I appreciate it. And I think this was, it was enjoyable for me, hopefully for you, hopefully stimulating for those who are listening. And so thanks for calling in. Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.
Yep. Have a good one. All right, there we go. Hey, thanks. That was the first call in a while. I appreciate it. Thank you. I don't want to just be spouting off ideas and not getting pushback. I think pushback is super helpful. I don't think it's a dishonest analogy, because again, the analogy is trying to show that the barometer does not cause the weather. It does not apply, because Jesse is saying it's dishonest. I don't think it's that. And so it's not meant to describe every aspect of this whole conversation. But anyways, to finish up the conversation on Armin Navabi, here's how he kind of concludes. All of Pascal's wager, if you forgot about that from the front half, is that he says, look, even if there was a God, there is simply no way of knowing that the assumptions laid out in the wager are actually accurate. And again, that's why Pascal is going to use a lot of different arguments and evidences to point to the truth of Christianity, not simply this sort of belief. And then he says, moreover, believing in God simply to avoid the punishment of hell is an empty type of belief. That's true. If we're just simply saying, I believe because I want to get out of hell free, that's not a belief. True faith should be believing true things about God, a love of God, and a commitment to God to follow him no matter what. Not just, I don't want to go to hell. And so hopefully there's a deeper faith that grows and develops there. And so he then kind of jumps on and says, his last thing is, well, what's the harm in believing in God? And he says, well, Pascal suggests there's nothing to lose in believing in God if he's not real. And he goes, well, that's not true. Believing in God can come with a high price for some. The rights of some individuals and groups are oppressed in the name of God. The lives of billions of people around the world are affected by religious belief, blindly accepting claims and making decisions as if they were true. And the hope that our chosen deity exists and will reward our efforts seems like a poor wager when there is no evidence to support the choice, and especially if real people are suffering as a result. And again, I think, look, it's true that people suffer for their beliefs. And so that's not what Pascal, I think, is talking about here, is that, oh, you lose nothing for believing. He's talking about, again, consider the next life. It's not saying that there's no difference whatsoever, because clearly other cultures and worldwide people are affected and treated differently for the beliefs that they have. There is an immediate, reward and punishment or pain and difficulties. And even Jesus says, you'll suffer because of me. So yes, there's suffering to be a Christian. Pascal is talking about, hey, the person who's apathetic and says, I just don't really care to think about this. It's saying, hold on a second. What you do now has eternal consequence. And it's there in which there's no difference. Either you're just dead and stay dead, or you go somewhere else. Let's stop and think about this. So I think if we frame it rightly, there's a power to Pascal's wager. I think it's often misunderstood and misapplied, and therefore it's shown to be not effective. But I think if you understand it that way, I think it can be powerful to just say, hey, let's awaken some conversations, just kind of what happened there with Phantom X. And let's awaken some conversations and actually talk through these things, because they're worth talking about as we try to show that God is good, that he exists, and have this sort of conversation. So again, Phantom X, thanks for calling in. Jesse, thank you for all your comments. Sorry I couldn't get to all of them. And everybody else, thank you so much for watching. Hopefully it was enjoyable. You can like it, share it, pass it along to others. And there's going to be a lot of other videos that pop up over here on the side. Next week, there won't be a show because I'm going to be in Utah, but I'll be back the week after that. So with that, have a wonderful rest of your day. Continue to think deeply about God, Christianity, and Jesus, because they are worth thinking about. See you next time, everybody. God bless.